Welcome, chess fans, to a clash of titans. We have Erigaisi Arjun with the white pieces taking on the formidable Jan Krzysztof Duda. The players are settling into a quiet Slav defense, but don't be fooled. Deep strategic waters lie ahead. Both sides are developing logically, mirroring each other's moves. We see a solid, symmetrical pawn triangle in the center, a classic setup where both players are fighting for subtle advantages. Development continues. White fianchettos the light-squared bishop, while black prepares for action in the center, lining up the pieces and finally launching the thematic pawn break to e5. The central tension boils over as black pushes the e-pawn forward, and Arjun's response is anything but quiet. He launches a pawn storm on the king side with g4, looking to rip open the position around Duda's king. The center opens up with a pawn trade, and Duda challenges white's knight with bishop to b4. After a flurry of exchanges, white is left with the bishop pair, a key long-term advantage in this open position. The queens start to dance. White's queen probes the queen side from b4, and black pushes the a-pawn to challenge it, creating new weaknesses to target. And Arjun gets greedy. He snaps up the pawn on b7, but this is a serious inaccuracy. The queen is now dangerously far from the action, and black has a powerful way to punish this. The killer move was rook to e7, trapping the queen and seizing a huge advantage, but Duda misses his chance. Instead of trapping the queen, he plays queen to d6. This lets white right back into the game. That critical move, rook to e7, would have put immense pressure on white, but now the position is roughly equal again. With the immediate crisis over, both sides look to regroup. Rooks come to the c-file and a trade is initiated, simplifying the position slightly as the battle for control continues. And Arjun makes an excellent recapture, taking back with the bishop on c1. This is the only move that keeps the balance. The bishop maintains control of the c-file and keeps white's position solid. Black's rook becomes a monster. It slides into c8 and then crashes down to the second rank on c2, putting immense pressure on white's position and tying down the pieces. White plays pawn to b4, but this is another slip. It creates weaknesses and allows black's rook to become even more dangerous. The stronger move was to challenge black's rook with queen to b5, but now Duda can ramp up the pressure with rook to b2. And another missed opportunity. Black pushes the pawn to h5, but this lets white off the hook. The crushing move was rook to b2, taking full advantage of white's last move. The advantage swings back towards equality. Action on the king side sees an en passant capture, and black's knight lands on h6. White's queen then swings all the way over to a6, eyeing black's queenside weaknesses. Black plays queen to akalen, but this isn't the most accurate. Duda had a great chance to trade queens by taking on a6, which would have simplified into a very favorable endgame for him. This move keeps the complexity, but white is doing just fine, and now Arjun misses a chance. He plays bishop to d1, a passive move. He should have just grabbed the pawn on a5 with his queen. This slip allows black to develop a new threat by bringing the bishop to g4. Black does exactly that, developing the bishop to g4 to put pressure on white's kingside. In response, Arjun finally decides to capture the loose pawn on a5 with the queen. Duda retreats the queen to c8, but this lets the pressure off. The much stronger move was queen to c6, keeping white's pieces tied down and maintaining a clear advantage. Now the game is balanced once again. A mistake from white. The rook moves to g1, a very strange square. Arjun needed to resolve the central tension by taking the pawn on d5. This move hands the advantage right back to black, who can now punish it with the powerful bishop to f3, and Duda finds it. The bishop takes the defender on d1, removing a key piece around the white king, and Arjun has no choice. The king is forced to recapture on d1, stepping out into the open where it will become a target. Black's rook immediately invades, landing on a2 to attack the exposed king. White's queen shifts over to c5, desperately trying to create counter threats and defend. A huge turning point. Duda gives a check with the rook to a1, but this is a massive mistake. This check actually helps the white king escape. The winning move was queen to f5, creating unstoppable threats. The game swings from completely winning for black to slightly better for white in a single move, and the white king happily steps away from the danger, moving up to c2, another inaccuracy from black. The queen moves to a6. To keep the pressure on, he needed to play queen to h3, creating new problems for white. Now Arjun's advantage is becoming clear. Excellent from Arjun. He pushes the pawn to b5, a fantastic move that kicks the black queen away and starts creating a powerful passed pawn on the queen side. This is the only move to cement his advantage. Black gives a check with the queen to a4, but this doesn't accomplish much. A better try was queen to f6, repositioning for a better defense, but white is firmly in control. And what a calm, precise response. The king steps to b2, the only square that keeps the winning advantage. The king is now perfectly safe from any checks. Black's queen repositions to d1, desperately trying to find some way back into the game. Another brilliant and only move from white, bishop to c1 is a fantastic defensive resource, cleverly preparing to neutralize the threat of black's rook on the a-file. What a find! Black plays knight to d7 but misses the best practical chance. The most stubborn defense was to sacrifice the rook by taking the pawn on a3. which would have created far more problems for white to solve. White isn't rushing. A preparatory check with the queen to c8 forces the black king to h7, before Arjun proceeds to eliminate the dangerous black rook. And there it is. The king takes the rook on a1, the only move to seal the deal. White is now up a rook for a knight and has a decisive material advantage. This should be a straightforward conversion. Black's knight jumps into b6, trying to create complications, but white's queen finds the perfect square on c3, shutting down all of black's counterplay and maintaining complete control. Black's knight lands on c4, but this is inaccurate and only simplifies white's task. A better defensive try was to bring the knight over to f5 to help defend the kingside. A slight imprecision from Arjun. He plays rook to h1. While still winning, the engine prefers the more clinical knight to d2, which would have ended the game more quickly. This gives black a tiny bit of hope. The position gets messy as black's queen and knight probe white's defenses. Pieces are flying around the board, but white's extra rook is still a massive looming advantage. Black grabs the pawn on f2, but this isn't the best defensive idea. It was more important to keep the knight active with a move like knight to g4, maintaining coordination between the pieces. And here's a mistake from white. The rook takes the knight on h2, but this trade actually helps black. Arjun should have played the tactical shot knight takes e4, keeping more attacking pieces on the board. Black is happy to recapture, and the queen takes the rook on h2. White's winning advantage has shrunk considerably. Another imprecision from white. The queen drops back to e1. Arjun is struggling to find the cleanest path to victory. That recurring tactical idea, knight takes pawn on e4, was once again the best move. The battle rages on. Black's queen snaps up the pawn on h4, and white's queen repositions to f2, as both players jockey for the best squares. Black plays queen to d8, but misses the most resilient defense. Tucking the king away to g8 would have made white's task much more difficult. This allows Arjun to increase the pressure. A major mistake from white. He gives a check with the queen to f5, but this lets black off the hook completely. The winning move was simply to take the pawn on f7, which would have been decisive. Black's king calmly steps to g8, and suddenly the advantage has all but vanished. The complexity is proving too much for both players. White's queen to f2 is inaccurate, but black's pawn push to g6 is also a slip, missing a chance for active counterplay. White centralizes the queen to c2, a strong move. Black's response, queen to d6, is another inaccuracy, missing a better defensive setup and allowing white to build the advantage again, and white again misses the strongest continuation. The knight moves to e2, but for the third or fourth time, the powerful tactical shot knight takes e4 was the key to a decisive advantage. Black's knight grabs the pawn on a3, but this is not the best defense. Pushing the pawn to g5 would have created more problems and offered better resistance in a very difficult position. Finally, white simplifies. The queen lands on c5, forcing a trade. After the queens come off the board, white's recapture with the pawn on c5 creates a passed pawn and a completely winning endgame. Black's knight takes the pawn on b5, and this is the only move to prolong the game. It's a desperate but necessary attempt to create counterplay in a lost position. White improves the knight, bringing it to the commanding d4 square. But black's decision to trade with knight takes knight on d4 is a mistake that simplifies white's task. He had to try and keep pieces on the board, and white's recapture, pawn takes knight on d4, is perfect. This creates a monster-passed d-pawn that will be the decisive factor. Now it's a matter of technique. White's king begins its methodical march up the board, transforming from a defensive piece into a key attacker to support the passed pawns. Black pushes the pawn to f6, but this is an inaccuracy that only weakens the king's position, and white immediately capitalizes as the bishop snaps up the pawn on f6. Black's king moves to c6, but this isn't the most stubborn defense. Pushing the pawn to e3 would have been more resilient and made white's task a little harder. We now enter a long maneuvering phase. White's king and bishop work in perfect harmony, methodically probing and pushing back black's king, preparing to break down the final wall of resistance. White's king finally arrives on the king side, ready to attack the remaining pawns. In response, black makes a desperate pawn push to g5, trying to create chaos. A small slip from white, the king moves to g3. The faster and more direct path to victory was to simply capture the pawn with bishop takes g5, and that pawn push is another inaccuracy from black. Playing pawn to g4 only helps white's king penetrate even further and speeds up the winning plan. The white king gobbles up the free pawn on g4 and continues its relentless advance up the board, getting closer and closer to black's remaining pawns and king. Black's king moves to the wrong square. By stepping to c4, it allows white's c-pawn to become a massive threat. The king had to stay back and try to blockade, and white misses the knockout blow. King to e5 is good, but the killer move was pawn to c6, which would have led to a quick and unstoppable pawn promotion. Another inaccuracy from black in a completely lost position. The king moves to d3, but stepping back to b5 would have offered a tiny bit more resistance. White's bishop moves to f4, setting a subtle trap, and black falls for it. The pawn push to e3 is the final decisive mistake. It walks right into a brilliant finishing combination. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Arjun sacrifices the bishop, taking the pawn on e3. This stunning move removes the pawn defender, allowing white's king to invade and the c-pawn to march towards promotion. A fantastic finish. Black recaptures with the king taking the bishop on e3, but this is not the best defense, though the position was already hopeless. Stepping to e2 was a slightly better try. And now the win is trivial. The white king takes the pawn on d5, clearing the way. The c-pawn immediately pushes forward to c6, beginning its unstoppable march to become a queen. The black king is helpless as the white pawn continues its journey, landing on c7, just one square away from promotion. The end is near, and black's king moves to c3, a final mistake that allows white to promote with a decisive check. Moving to d1 would have forced white to be a little more careful, and there it is. The pawn reaches c8 and promotes to a brand new queen, with check. The black king is forced to move to d3, but the game appears to be over. Unbelievable! A shocking blunder! Arjun plays queen to c5 and throws away a completely won position. The simple queen to c1 would have won easily. Now, if black finds the right move, this is a dead draw. What a turnaround! Arjun blunders a one game, and Duda has a chance to save it with a miracle draw. The only move is to bring the king towards the action. The move he needs to find is king to e3. The king steps up to e3. White's queen checks from c8. The king continues its march to f4. The queen swings over to h3, and the king escapes to g5, and it's a draw. But in the heat of the moment, Duda plays king to d2, and that is a tragic mistake. It walks right back into a forced checkmate, and Arjun finds it. The king moves to e5, the only move that initiates a forced mating sequence. The drama is not over yet. Black's king is driven back, forced to the e1 square. White has a forced mate on the board, a second chance to win this game. The key is to use the queen to control the king's escape squares. The winning move is queen to c2. The queen cuts off the king at c2. The king is forced to f1. Now the pawn pushes to d5, king to g1, and pawn to d6 seals the deal. But incredibly, Arjun pushes the pawn to d5 immediately, and this is another blunder. The forced mate is gone. The chaos continues. Black plays king to e2, but this is an instant blunderback, allowing another forced mate. Moving to d2 would have kept the fight going. The game is swinging back and forth with every move. For the third time, white has a forced mate on the board. The winning idea is the same as before. He has to find the queen check to cut off the king's escape. The move is queen to c2 check. The queen checks on c2, king is forced to f3, the pawn advances to d6, king runs to g4, and pawn to d7 will lead to mate. But it's just not his day for finishing. Arjun pushes the pawn to d6, and he has missed the checkmate for a second time in a row. This is unbelievable. The position is still winning for white, but the forced mate is gone. Black must be precise to survive. The only move to continue fighting is to bring the king back towards the center. The king steps to d3, white pushes the pawn to d7, the king returns to d2, the queen moves to c4, and after king to d1, black is still fighting. But after all that chaos, Duda makes the final mistake, playing king to f3. This time, there will be no more chances, white has a clear path to victory, and this time Arjun is precise. The queen moves to d4, forcing the black king back to e2 and setting up the final decisive blow. And that's the one. Queen to e4, check. A fantastic final move that forces the promotion of the d-pawn and leads to an unstoppable checkmate. Duda has seen enough. What an absolutely unbelievable game. After a deep strategic battle, we witnessed a chaotic endgame filled with mutual blunders and missed opportunities. In the end, after multiple twists and turns, Erigaisi Arjun secures the victory. White wins.